All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Absolutely. Always up for a good deep dive.
Okay, so today we're on the hunt for those book adaptations that time seems to have, I don't know, kind of forgotten about.
Ah, yeah, those hidden gems.
Exactly, the ones that might have slipped your mind, even if you're a diehard fan of the original books.
It happens, especially with so many adaptations coming out all the time.
Right, it's like an avalanche of content these days.
Exactly.
So, our guide on this little treasure hunt is an article from Listverse.
Oh, Listverse. Always a good source for interesting lists.
Right, I love that site. The article is called 10 Book Adaptations You Forgot About. So get ready to rediscover some classics, maybe even see familiar stories in a whole new light.
Yeah, it's amazing how our memories can be kind of selective, especially when it comes to adaptations. Sometimes those big, flashy, critically acclaimed versions just overshadow the earlier attempts.
Yeah, like the blockbusters cast a giant shadow. So let's shed some light on those forgotten adaptations, starting with, well, how could we not? The Lord of the Rings.
Oh, a classic.
Everyone knows those epic Peter Jackson films, but before those came out, way back in 1978, there was an animated version.
Right, and this one is actually a really fascinating example of how filmmakers were pushing boundaries even back then.
Oh, really?
They used this technique called rotoscoping, which involves tracing over live-action footage to create the animation.
So it's like a blend of live action and animation.
Exactly, and they actually still use it today, like in films like A Scanner Darkly.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I've seen that one.
But back in '78, this was a pretty innovative way to try and capture that, grandeur and scale of Tolkien's world.
Especially without the CGI we take for granted now.
Exactly. It makes you think about how what was considered cutting edge visually back then might look a little dated to us now.
Yeah, our expectations have definitely been, shaped by all the advancements in special effects.
For sure.
What we might criticize as cheap looking now might have been absolutely mind blowing for people seeing it for the first time in the 70s.
Absolutely.
Right, it's all about context. All right, speaking of being visually spoiled, let's travel to another world that's been brought to life on screen numerous times, Narnia.
Oh, Narnia, such a rich world for adaptations.
Right, we all have our own mental image of Aslan, the White Witch, those magical landscapes. But before the CGI-heavy films of the 2000s, there were these TV adaptations using techniques that might seem, well, a little quaint now.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
We're talking 1967, 1979, even a whole serial that ran from 1988 to 1990.
Wow, a cereal. Okay.
And they weren't shying away from trying to bring those, fantastical elements to life.
Yeah.
But they were doing it with things like animation, animatronics, even puppets.
Wait, puppets?
Puppets.
I can't even imagine Aslan as a giant puppet.
It was a very different vibe than the CGI Aslan we're used to.
I bet.
But it really highlights the resourcefulness of those early adaptations.
Oh, totally.
You had these filmmakers who were passionate about these stories, working within limitations, and coming up with these really clever ways to portray creatures and worlds that, most people thought were just impossible to depict visually.
Right, it forces you to think outside the box. It wasn't just about spectacle, it was about making do with what you had and still managing to evoke that sense of wonder.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've had epic fantasy with rotoscoping and puppet lions. What about something a little more interactive? Believe it or not, Ken Follett's historical epic Pillars of the Earth got adapted into a point-and-click video game.
Wow, I did not know that.
It was even released in episodes between 2017 and 2018. This one totally flew under my radar.
Mine too.
This adaptation takes a really interesting approach because it lets the audience, or in this case the player, have some control over the narrative.
Oh, that's cool.
Right, so imagine stepping into the world of the book and actually influencing how the story unfolds.
It challenges that whole idea of passive storytelling that you get with most adaptations.
It's like choosing your own adventure, but on this grand historical scale.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder, is this kind of interactive storytelling the future of adaptations, especially for these really complex, richly detailed novels?
Yeah, it's a fascinating possibility. What if you could experience, like, Game of Thrones from different characters' perspectives, making choices that lead to branching storylines? Or what if you could make choices that lead to completely different endings than the ones in the book or the show?
Okay, my mind is officially blown. Interactive Game of Thrones, someone get on that. But for now, let's shift gears from interactive storytelling to a character who really needs no introduction. Hannibal Lecter.
Oh, Hannibal, a classic.
Anthony Hopkins' performance is iconic, but before Hopkins put on that chilling mask, it was actually Brian Cox who first brought Hannibal to the big screen.
Right, in the 1986 film Manhunter, based on Red Dragon.
I did not realize that.
Now, what's interesting here is that while Hopkins gave us this, grand, almost operatic Hannibal, Cox's portrayal was much more subdued, almost like a chilling whisper in a dark room.
Oh, wow.
It really highlights how different actors can bring entirely different nuances to the same character.
It's a great reminder that there's not just one way to interpret a character. And sometimes a more subtle, understated performance can be just as impactful, if not more so. I'm definitely adding Manhunter to my watch list now.
It's definitely worth a watch,
Right.
especially to compare those two very different takes on Hannibal.
Definitely. And speaking of different takes, how about we move on to a character who's had a real surge in popularity recently? Geralt of Rivia, The Witcher.
Oh, The Witcher, everywhere these days.
It's everywhere, the Netflix series, all the video games. But before Geralt was this, global phenomenon, there was actually a Polish film and TV show called The Hexer. Came out way back in 2001.
Wow, the early 2000s.
I'm guessing most people haven't even heard of this one.
Probably not. And to be honest, it didn't quite capture the complexity and depth of the world that Sapkowski created in his books.
Oh, really?
It was based on some of his early short stories, and you can definitely tell it was made on a much smaller budget. Especially with the special effects technology of the time, it just couldn't quite bring that world to life in the same way that the later adaptations did.
Makes sense. It's like those early adaptations were laying the groundwork, figuring things out, and then the later adaptations with more resources and advancements in technology could build on that foundation and really take things to the next level.
Exactly. And sometimes, even those early adaptations that might seem a bit rough around the edges now, they're really interesting from a historical perspective. They show us where it all began and how far things have come.
It's like those grainy black and white photos of your grandparents. You appreciate them for what they are, even if they're not as crisp and clear as the photos we take now. Okay, so we've talked about adaptations that were limited by technology, but what happens when the author themselves isn't happy with how their book is adapted?
Oh, that's always interesting territory.
Right. Let's talk about Stephen King and Stanley Kubrick's iconic film, The Shining.
Oh, yeah, The Shining.
King was famously unhappy with Kubrick's interpretation. So much so that he wrote and produced a 1997 miniseries that he felt was more faithful to the book.
Wow, taking matters into his own hands.
Right. So it's a battle of visions, the directors versus the authors. I'm curious, have you ever found yourself siding more with the author's vision or the director's interpretation when it comes to adaptations?
Oh, that's a tough one. It really depends on the specific adaptation.
Right.
Sometimes a director's unique vision can elevate a story in a way the author might not have even imagined, but other times it can feel like a betrayal of the source material. It's a delicate balance, for sure.
Yeah, it's like this delicate dance, isn't it? And sometimes, like in the case of The Shining, even the author getting directly involved doesn't guarantee a satisfying outcome for everyone.
Right, exactly.
All right, so we've seen adaptations that were ambitious but limited by technology, ones that sparked debate about authorial intent. But what about adaptations that just, I don't know, completely miss the mark, even with big budgets and special effects?
Oh, yeah, there are definitely some of those out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that 2011 Three Musketeers movie, the one directed by Paul W.S. Anderson.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. It just didn't quite capture the spirit of the book, did it?
Not really. I mean, it had a star-studded cast, big action set pieces, all the special effects you could ask for.
But it felt more like, I don't know, a video game cutscene than a swashbuckling adventure.
Yeah, I think it tried to be a little too cool for its own good with all the slow-motion fight sequences and explosions.
It lacked that sense of fun and adventure that makes The Three Musketeers so classic.
Right. It's a good example of how sometimes trying to modernize a story can actually kind of backfire.
Like they were prioritizing spectacle over substance.
Exactly. There was a trend around that time to make adaptations that felt more like video games.
Right, with those over-the-top action sequences and visuals.
But it often came at the expense of character development and good storytelling.
Sometimes those quieter, more character-driven adaptations can be much more powerful, even if they don't have all the bells and whistles.
Exactly. And that brings us to a film that might surprise you. Before the critically acclaimed 2013 film 12 Years a Slave, starring Chiwetel Ejiofor, there was a 1984 TV movie called Solomon Northup's Odyssey.
Oh, wow, I had no idea.
It starred Avery Brooks. who you might know from Spencer for Hire or Star Trek, Deep Space Nine.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It's amazing to think that this story, which had such a profound impact on audiences in 2013, was already being told decades earlier.
It's a testament to the power of Northup's story.
Absolutely. And the importance of remembering these historical narratives. Each adaptation offers a different lens through which to view the past.
And they can contribute to a broader understanding of these important events.
Exactly. It shows that sometimes these stories need to be told and retold for different generations to really grasp their significance.
It makes you wonder what other stories from the past deserve a second look.
That's a great point. Maybe there are forgotten adaptations out there that, while not perfect, still have something valuable to offer.
Like hidden treasures waiting to be rediscovered. Okay, so we've journeyed from epic fantasy to historical drama, but let's not forget about fairy tales. We all know the Disney version of Snow White, but did you know there was a gothic horror adaptation called Snow White, A Tale of Terror?
Oh, yes. That one's quite a departure from the singing birds and woodland creatures.
It came out in 1997 and starred Sigourney Weaver as the evil queen.
Oh, she was brilliant in that role.
I can only imagine.
It really embraced those dark, unsettling elements that are often glossed over in modern adaptations.
Right, it's like they went back to the source material and said, let's not sugarcoat this.
Exactly. Remember, fairy tales in their original forms were often quite grim, dealing with some very adult themes.
There's something about those primal fears and unsettling images that can really stick with you. Maybe we've gone a little too far in sanitizing fairy tales for modern audiences.
It's possible.
Okay, speaking of embracing a different tone, let's talk about Casino Royale, but not the Daniel Craig one.
Ah, you're talking about the 1967 Casino Royale, the comedic spoof of the James Bond franchise.
Talk about a tonal shift.
It's a far cry from both the book and the later, more serious adaptation.
It's like they took this iconic James Bond character and turned him into a caricature. I bet that raised some eyebrows back then.
It definitely did. It was a bold experiment. It reflects the fact that adaptations don't always have to be reverent to the source material.
Sometimes they can be playful, subversive, even critical of the original work.
Exactly. It's like they were saying, we're going to deconstruct this genre and have some fun with it.
It makes you wonder how audiences at the time reacted to seeing their beloved James Bond turned into a comedic figure.
Probably depended on their sense of humor. Some might have seen it as sacrilege, while others probably appreciated the audacity of it all. What's interesting is that we now have these two completely different takes on Casino Royale. One a spoof, and one a serious, gritty reboot.
It really shows how adaptations can reflect changing tastes and sensibilities over time.
It's a fascinating example of how the same story can be interpreted in vastly different ways, depending on the cultural context.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the creativity and flexibility of adaptation as an art form.
It's not just about transferring a story from one medium to another. It's about reimagining it, reinterpreting it, even reinventing it for a new audience.
Exactly. And sometimes those reimaginings, even the ones that might seem outlandish or unconventional, can be just as insightful and entertaining as the more faithful adaptations.
It's like those what-if scenarios that comic book fans love to debate. What if Spider-Man had never been bitten by the spider? What if Batman had been raised by the Joker?
Sometimes exploring those alternative paths can lead to some really interesting discoveries.
It reminds us that there's no one right way to adapt a story. It's all about finding the approach that best serves the story and the audience. So we've seen adaptations that were groundbreaking, those that sparked controversy, and those that just tried to have a little fun. But what about those adaptations that were just plain forgettable? The ones that faded into obscurity despite having some redeeming qualities? Are there any hidden gems lurking in the shadows of cinematic history that deserve a second chance?
Oh, there are tons, Adaptations that maybe didn't make a huge splash when they were first released, but still have something unique to offer.
It's like with music, right? Sometimes those albums that weren't like chart toppers end up becoming those like cult classics.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
finding those bands that only like true music lovers know about. And you're like, wait, why isn't everyone listening to this?
Totally. So what forgotten adaptations would you put on your like must-watch list for those in the know, so to speak?
Well, one that comes to mind is that Solomon Northup's Odyssey, the 1984 TV movie we mentioned earlier.
Oh, yeah, right.
It predates the, more famous adaptation of 12 Years a Slave. And while it might not have the same, production value, it still offers a really powerful and moving portrayal of Northup's experience.
Hmm.
It's worth seeking out, not just for its historical significance, but also for Avery Brooks's incredible performance.
It's funny you mentioned that. I'm actually adding that to my list right now.
Oh, good.
It's a reminder that sometimes those smaller, lesser-known adaptations can pack just as much emotional punch as the, big-budget
Oh,
blockbusters.
absolutely. And that's part of the fun of these deep dives, isn't it?
Totally.
Rediscovering these forgotten stories and seeing them with fresh eyes. It's about, expanding our understanding of adaptation as an art form and appreciating the diversity of approaches and interpretations. And it's about challenging ourselves to look beyond the obvious choices and, seek out those hidden gems that might surprise and delight us.
It's like being an archaeologist, but instead of digging for ancient artifacts, we're digging through film history.
Exactly, yeah.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into forgotten book adaptations, I have one final, I guess, thought-provoking question for you and for everyone listening.
Okay, shoot.
What adaptation would you love to see rediscovered, or maybe even reimagined for modern audiences? Could be a childhood favorite, a book you think deserves a better adaptation, or even a story that's never been adapted before.
Ooh, that's a good one. I'll have to think about that.
Mm.
There's so many possibilities.
Yeah,
Maybe there's like a classic novel that could benefit from a fresh perspective or a lesser known work that has the potential to be a cinematic masterpiece.
yeah.
So many stories out there just waiting to be brought to life.
And maybe by, shining a light on these forgotten adaptations, sparking these conversations about them, we can inspire like a new generation of filmmakers to take risks, explore new approaches, unearth those hidden gems that deserve a second chance to shine. It's exciting to think about all the possibilities.
Absolutely. Who knows? Maybe one day we'll be revisiting this list and talking about some of the adaptations that were like inspired by this very conversation. It's a reminder that the world of adaptation is constantly evolving and there's always something new to discover.
Exactly. So I guess I'll just say, go ahead, dear listener, dive into the world of forgotten adaptations. You might just find your new favorite film or TV show, or even spark an idea for the next great adaptation. Happy watching.
Happy watching.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the world of stories.